It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
The holidays serve the power structure very well. Mass distraction and unrestrained consumption are the theme of the day during this time of year. Though all of us want to enjoy our lives and our families, if we ignore what is unfolding around us in the process, haven't we missed the point? Haven't we lost our way? If we truly love our children, is it not our obligation to preserve and protect their future above all else? How do we interact with our families over the holidays? Do we completely pretend everything is fine in the world? Or do we take the time to remember that we owe our lives to our children and that immense challenges are rapidly closing in on us all? Consider this quote from one of the greatest human beings to live amongst us, Dr. Martin Luther King. An individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Something to deeply consider, that statement. Numerous breaking and dire frontline reports to cover in this episode. Stay tuned. This is Dane Wigington. You're listening to the Global Alert News Hour, episode number 176 for December 22nd, 2018. This is a commercial-free news hour brought to you by geoengineeringwatch.org, paid for by geoengineeringwatch.org. This news hour is broadcast throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM. Saturday mornings, 6 to 7 AM, and now rebroadcast Sunday mornings from 6 to 7 as well. Global Alert News is also rebroadcast on the East Coast by the PRN Radio Network on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Recordings of this broadcast can be found at geoengineeringwatch.org under the recent top stories and radio sections. If you're aware of any radio station that may be willing to pick up the commercial-free Global Alert News Hour, please let us know. We will gladly provide the downloads of our broadcast to other stations for free. Our only goal is to sound the alarm. If you're in the Reading area, free geoengineeringwatch.org informational materials can be picked up from Orchard Nutrition. For those not in the Reading area, the latest Geoengineering Watch awareness-raising materials can be ordered from the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org for our approximate cost of producing and shipping. Final short announcement on the Jim Fair Group and Events, staunch ally in the fight to expose and halt climate engineering. There's a geoengineeringwatch.org informational booth at all Jim Fair events, fully stocked with free materials. If you attend these events to pick up those materials and help us to sound the alarm, you can get into the event for free. Tell them at the ticket booth why you are there. We need everyone's help to sound the alarm. Time is not on our side. The next Jim Fair event is in Santa Rosa, California, January 4th through January 6th. At the Sonoma County Fairgrounds from January 11th to January 13th in Del Mar, California at the Del Mar Fairgrounds, January 18th through January 20th, San Rafael, California at the Marin Center Exhibit Hall. Go to the Jim Fair homepage for more information on where coming events will be. Our thanks to Jim Fair for their incredibly unyielding help in this battle to expose and halt climate engineering. Moving on. Official sources of information, or more correctly, disinformation, and the paid liars that represent the official disinformation, tell us that we should believe their denial of the climate engineering atrocities in our skies, which anyone with open eyes can readily see. They, the disinformation sources, tell us not to believe our lying eyes, but to believe them. They tell us that our so-called government would never deploy anything that would damage the climate system or cause a public danger. What a blatant, glaring lie. All of us are needed in the desperate battle to fully expose that lie and other lies, of which there are too many to possibly go into on this broadcast, but let's hit the most pertinent recent reports that are relevant, most relevant to all of us. That's what this program is about. Global Alert News is about the news you need to know. All of us need to know if we're to have any chance of collectively changing course from the current path of near-term omnicide that we are all on. All of us are needed in the desperate battle to fully expose the climate engineering issue, and countless other issues that pose a very grave and immediate threat to all of our futures. On that note of credible, verifiable information, as I stated last week, geoengineeringwatch.org's most complete and comprehensive PowerPoint presentation ever, by far, that was given live in Northern California recently, will be posted on January 1st, 2019 at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. This is a geoengineering A to Z presentation. Stay tuned for that. David Attenborough just said this at a UN conference. The collapse of civilization is on the horizon. Unfortunately, that statement, as dire as it may sound, falls far short of the severity and immediacy of the unfolding scenario we collectively face. Collapse of civilization, and indeed the entire web of life, is not just on the horizon, it's kicking the front door in now. From multiple sources, the warnings continue to get closer to the truth, closer to what we have tried to warn about at geoengineeringwatch.org for a decade. Here's a headline to consider. Risks of domino effect of tipping points greater than thought, study says. Multiple sources covered this. From this report, scientists warn policymakers not to ignore links and stress that every action counts. From that report, policymakers have severely underestimated the risks of ecological tipping points, according to a new study that shows collapses are interrelated and could amplify one another. Report states this as well. We are heading even faster towards the edge of the cliff. Let me add some clarity to this excerpt from this report. We are not heading toward the cliff. We're over the edge. We're through the guardrail. I've tried to make this clear in countless broadcasts. We're plummeting toward the bottom of the canyon. We are past the point of no return. From a biosphere standpoint, we passed the point of no return likely several decades ago. When many hear this, they think, why try then? Why bother trying? Because even though we will never again know the thriving planet that we once knew, if we can salvage anything, is that not worth the fight? It absolutely is worth it. It's our obligation. It's what we owe to our children, and indeed what we owe to the entire web of life, without which we would have never existed in the first place. Interesting at this time of year, even though many would claim to agree with the premise, it is better to give than to receive, as I've stated in the past, how many consider that principle when it comes to nature and the web of life from which we have taken? As a species, we have taken and taken and taken, and we are about to reap the consequences of not giving back. This must be considered. And at this particular time of year, when so many are spending time in their congregations, in whatever spiritual group they associate with, how many behind the pulpit are remembering our obligation, our scriptural obligation, our obligation with all the major traditions, all the major spiritual traditions, to be good stewards of the planet? How many behind the pulpit are even acknowledging in any way, shape, or form the severity of what's unfolding and the fact that there is an all-out assault on Earth's life support systems that will kill us all very, very soon? Countless forms of assault. Climate engineering mathematically being the single greatest form, but countless forms. And yet it is not being acknowledged. And so many so-called spiritual leaders simply going along with the official narratives that it's all a hoax, that it's all fear porn, if you will. Is it really fear porn when we look at statistical facts that 90% of the food fish in the oceans, the pelagic fish populations, are dead and gone? 90% of bluefin tuna gone. 80 to 90% of global insect populations, aquatic and terrestrial, gone. We've lost 60% plus of Earth's wildlife populations in the past 40 years. We're losing 15,000 times the rate of species to extinction than the background rates, 1.5 million of normal. Is that fear porn? That mathematically speaking, on the current rate of loss, wildlife will be gone by 2026, and we have so-called pastors whose job it is to face the truth and to do what they can to protect creation from their pulpit, and they do nothing because they live in fear of losing their 501c3 nonprofit. Is that what spirituality is about now? A nonprofit and making sure there's enough funds to build bigger and more lavish churches? That's not what it's about. And I know this personally from speaking to most of the major pastors in the Shasta County area who, as I've stated before, initially reject the science data I try to pass on about geoengineering, and who initially tell me, we're not interested. It's all in bigger hands. And every one of those pastors I have shamed into taking that data, and they probably threw it away afterward, by pointing out to them that Scripture which they claim to be an advocate for, does not allow us to do nothing. At this time of year, when so many are proclaiming their spirituality, how can this aspect be forgotten? How is that okay? It's not okay. There's a particular individual who I want to again acclaim for his courage from behind the pulpit. Former Constitutional Party presidential candidate in 2008, Dr. Chuck Baldwin. Dr. Baldwin has continued to show immense courage against immense resistance from the status quo. His most recent report title, here it is: Many Pastors and Christians Behaving More Like Herod Than Wise Men and Shepherds. Mr. Baldwin said this: bottom line, if America's pastors and Christians and conservatives would stop supporting America's perpetual war machines, most of these immoral wars would cease forthwith. How true, Dr. Baldwin. In full agreement with you. Encourage people to hear more of what Dr. Baldwin has to say. I recently did a 1-hour interview with him. That's available at geoengineeringwatch.org. Massive regions with largely rainless, often featureless skies, cloud canopy, highly sprayed with geoengineering aerosol cloud cover, continues over vast swaths of the planet. This is not to say that there's not deluge in some places or extreme winds in other places, but I know firsthand from being off the grid with wind, solar, and hydro, all of which the natural forces necessary to generate those forms of renewable energy have greatly diminished across the board, and this is exactly what we know we would get from climate engineering. Overall, listen to that term: less wind, less rain, less sun. That's scientifically proven. This doesn't mean that in certain regions it's not very different, like the east coast of the U.S. where it's raining and raining and raining. That is not a reflection of the entire world, however. I'll get to more of that later in this broadcast. The East Coast is being kept engineered into cool downs. More extreme measures or examples of that are coming. I'll cover that later in this broadcast as well. But it means overall, and I have had to upgrade with a larger generator, larger battery charger, because when I, in the past, didn't have to run a generator at all winter long. Now it's constant because there are so many days with no wind, no sun, and although we have gotten some rain, it's not in any way comparable to a decade ago or more. Not comparable. The geoengineering elephant in the sky continues to be ignored, which is, by the way, the greatest and most immediate threat we face mathematically, short of nuclear cataclysm. And that's not to ignore all the other forms of human damage to the planet. I'm not ignoring that. I'm simply saying that as a single element in the equation, climate engineering is mathematically the greatest. Exposing power structure crimes is becoming increasingly difficult for many reasons. So many sources and sites online are putting out increasingly fringe and factless false narratives that do great harm to the credibility of the anti-climate engineering cause, and in fact, to the credibility of the internet as a whole. Sharing and thus propagating false narratives of idiocy only undermines legitimate and scientifically supported efforts to expose and halt the climate engineering insanity and to expose other power structure crimes in general. Investigate and understand what you are sharing before you share it. What are the power structure controlled primary social media sources doing about the most outlandish and fringe false narratives online? those are still allowed to freely circulate. It is the goal of those in power to discredit the internet as a source of independent data. What, on the other hand, appears to be the most censored? The sources that offer credible data, which is very damaging to official narratives, official false narratives. Here's a case in point. Again, the Orwellian police state censorship continues to worsen rapidly. This is from Green Med Info, the science of natural healing. This was sent to them as their information was taken offline. From their report, Green Med Info is experiencing censorship for reporting on research on the unintended adverse effects of vaccinations and natural alternatives to the conventional medical interventions. 3 days ago, we received this notice. Here's the notice. We removed your account because it is linked to your website, which violated our misinformation policy. This policy includes things like promotion of false cures for terminal or chronic illness and anti-vaccination advice. Let me finish this before you come to a conclusion. This is still from the censorship online that took this site down. While we understand that this topic is very personal, i.e. vaccinations, we rely on information from nationally and internationally recognized institutions, including CDC and WHO, who help us determine if content violates these guidelines. Let me interpret this, summarize it, bottom line. Social media is telling a site that posts peer-reviewed science data that makes clear vaccinations are doing harm. But because that doesn't correlate with the official narrative of denial from criminal organizations like the CDC and the WHO, the internet police take it offline. That's censorship. Is that the freedom and democracy we're fighting for? Is that what it's all about? And yet how many people blindly waving their flags while this kind of censorship is going on, of data that we need now more than ever? These are truly dark days on planet Earth. Bottom line summary, peer-reviewed science studies are censored from online sources if those studies do not conform to the official false narratives, such as the lie that vaccinations are safe, which they are not. Moving on, from the UK Guardian and other sources. Current administration to strip pollution protections, harming vital wildlife. Waterway users that were formerly required to obtain permits to pollute are to be scaled back. The permits are to be scaled back, which could also allow pollution in drinking water. Of course, not could, not may, not might. It would, and it is. Gutting of wildlife environmental protections across the board. That's what's happened in the last 2 years more than any other administration, and I have nothing but disdain for all of them. But it's getting worse. Make no mistake. It's getting worse fast. From this report, the federal government plans to scale back the list of waterways for which land users are required to obtain permits to be able to pollute. Quote from the report, the Trump administration will stop at nothing to reward polluting industries and endanger our most treasured resources, said John Devine, director of the Federal Water Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Let me stop there for a minute because I don't like the Natural Resources Defense Council because they are nothing more than paid disinformation on other issues like climate engineering. Why won't they face climate engineering? Our attorneys have spoken to their attorneys. GeoengineeringWatch.org attorneys have spoken to the attorneys from Natural Resources Defense Council who will not face climate engineering because they're afraid of losing their 501c3 nonprofit. But that doesn't change the fact that this kind of rollback of environmental protection is total insanity. The environment's imploding. So what direction are we headed? Let's just loot, plunder, and pillage until there's absolutely nothing left. And for those that don't understand, when the environment dies, we die. And we are completely unleashing the corporate plunder of what's left of the environment. Moving on, from multiple sources, this related report. A devastating report details monumental assault on science at the Department of the Interior. Excerpt from this headline. A new report lays out how this has produced a, quote, monumental disaster for science at the Department of the Interior. The report by the Union of Concerned Scientists details how Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke and his minions have, in the space of 2 years, turned Department of Interior from a stewardship of public lands and natural resources into a front for the mining and oil and gas industries. Let's not forget the timber industries. Let's remember, I reported on this in the past, Mr. Zinke came here to Northern California as our forests were incinerating and spread the completely false conclusion that our forests are burning to the ground because we're just not cutting down enough trees. Absolute, blatant, glaring lie, which the science proves. And I have done more forest thinning than most people, even that are in the industry. I've done immense amount of hands-on, frontline, running crews, restoring habitat, thinning forests, which I'm in agreement with, but that is not the problem. That is not why our forests are burning to the ground. If that was the case, then why are forests in Siberia that have been untouched for millions of years, in the last 10 years, the burn rate has increased 10 times? Obviously, something else is going on, and that something else is climate engineering, which Ryan Zinke and the rest in his criminal cabal are tasked with hiding. Climate engineering. Bottom line, timber industry, what the Department of the Interior is doing. When these forests burn to the ground, it's an absolute bonanza for the logging industry, who gets to salvage log all those trees. That's immediately what happens as soon as these fires are done. They're salvage logging everything. Lands that they would not have been allowed to log otherwise. And those trees are still a very harvestable resource if they're harvested quickly after the fires occur. And that's exactly what's happening. So this is, again, the loot, plunder, and pillage policy that's worse now than ever before. No environment, no people. No trees, no people. Dead ocean, no people. No ozone layer, no people. All of this is converging at once. There's this related headline to consider from multiple sources. Former fossil fuels lobbyist to head Interior Department as Zinke leaves. Why is Zinke leaving? Because he has a long list of criminal prosecutions that are pending against him. Why is that a surprise? From this report, Ryan Zinke's exit as Interior Secretary elevates a former lobbyist to the job, meaning the top U.S. environmental agencies will now be run by people previously paid by industry. No surprise. The Deputy Secretary, David Bernhardt, will take over, at least temporarily, when Zinke steps down at the end of the year. He also could be in the running to head the department permanently. And the Environmental Protection Agency, the acting administrator, Andrew Wheeler, who is a coal lobbyist, will be nominated to keep the post. Industry heads running environmental protection agencies. The foxes running the hen house. The swamp's not being drained. Please, anybody who chooses to believe that is simply living in total denial. It's being filled with even more criminals. That's the fact of the matter. And that doesn't mean that that's not a promotion of Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama. And so many people are so trained to think dichotomously. From the time we enter our power structure controlled schools, we're trained to think dichotomously, us, them, our team against their team. If you don't like our team, you must like their team. Please, let's get past that. Let's get past that. The bottom line is government is criminality. That's all it is. It's state-sponsored mafia. That's what government has become. Changing gears, I want to make mention of a subject, lest I don't forget to bring that up in this broadcast. Here's a question. How many even remember Fukushima? Here's another question. How many think Fukushima is fixed? Remember when Fukushima first blew, we were told, don't worry, it's all fine? Like we are about 1,000 other things that are anything but fine? For the record, Fukushima continues to be a triple nuclear meltdown with no technology to fix it and no end in sight. A triple nuclear volcano. China syndrome times 3. An unfolding global extinction event all by itself if other converging factors don't do the job first, which is, in fact, most likely going to be the case. And consider that there are over 400 more nuclear facilities that will eventually face imminent meltdown on the current course. How dark does that horizon look? Moving on, how is the wildlife that is still actually alive doing? From Associated Press and other sources, Senate passes bill making it easier to kill sea lions, as if there's very many left. And as I've been over in previous broadcasts, this is particularly close to my heart, as I've spent a great deal of time alone with beautiful, playful, curious, friendly sea lions on too many occasions to even remember. dozens of pups, sea lion pups on some occasions, that won't leave you while you're in the water. And now their numbers so greatly diminished because of what we've done to the environment. And it's not just Fukushima. Many blame the ocean die-off on Fukushima alone. That's not correct. It's not correct. It's not that it's not a cataclysm. Of course it is. I just went over that. But there are countless factors affecting the oceans. We must consider them all. With climate engineering, again, being at the top of that list. Climate engineering destroying the ozone layer, which kills plankton, which destroys the bottom of the food chain. Everything else dies. The ocean iron fertilization, that's part of geoengineering. Major factor, taking the oxygen out of the oceans. Oceans are dying by the day. So now with whatever sea lions are left, the Senate is passing a bill make it easier to kill what's left. What callousness, what insanity. What a blatant breach of our responsibility to the whole, to be good stewards of the planet. Loot, plunder, and pillage while everyone is Christmas shopping and singing jingle bells. Those beautiful creatures, which are part of the web of life on which our lives depend, willfully slaughtered. Moving on. This shocking headline is from UK Guardian and other sources. Shark numbers decline by up to 90% in 5 decades off the Queensland coast. The report goes on to state that researchers conclude the most likely cause for the dramatic declines is commercial fishing. This conclusion is a half-truth. Commercial fishing is horrible, especially some of the fishing institutions that fin the sharks and put them back in the water alive to die a slow, protracted death because they have no fins. Unimaginably horrific practice. But there are many more factors, some of which I just went over. Bottom of the food chain is dropping out. But the mentality that we must kill sharks is so incredibly twisted. While I was in Australia, I met personally with Vic Hislop. Look him up. He's a particularly twisted individual that's considered the greatest, inappropriate word, but most prolific shark hunter in the world. And Vic Hislop said to my face, "We need to kill all of them," which I confronted him about. What a completely willfully blind notion that was. And he has killed who knows how many magnificent white sharks. Vic Hislop. He's all over the internet. Look him up. Met with him personally while I was in Australia on a dive expedition on the Great Barrier Reef. But this is the mentality of so many in our species. These are necessary elements in the web of life. 90% gone. I dove in a shark feeding frenzy off Fiji. Beautiful animals, amazing animals that didn't want to harm us that were filming them at that point. Animals that are absolutely imperative to the ecosystem. Almost gone. Almost gone. And people claim it's fear porn. They falsely claim that to make such a statement is fear porn. No, it's not fear porn. It's a fact. It's a statistical fact that all of us need to face and all of us need to do something about, or we will not be here long. From PhysOrg News and other sources, a new report further confirms the effects of global climate engineering operations. Moving on to the state of the biosphere as a whole. The report states the long dry, global water supplies are shrinking. From that report, a global study has found a paradox. Our water supplies are shrinking at the same time as climate change is generating more intense rain. The culprit, the report states, is the drying of soils. That's what researchers say, pointing to a world where drought-like conditions will become the new normal. The report states this is something that has been formerly missed. It states, we expected rainfall to increase since warmer air stores more moisture. I've been over that in many broadcasts, 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. And that was what climate models predicted. What we did not expect is that despite all the extra rain everywhere in the world, the large rivers are drying out. Now, does that make any sense? They're omitting so much in this report. Although there is more intense rainfall in many locations, overall, there is more protracted drought. Why? Because climate engineering is totally disrupting the evaporative cycles, blocking direct sunlight. It's reducing wind, which also reduces evaporation. So although there is deluges in places, there is much more protracted drought because of climate engineering primarily. This is not to negate the greenhouse gas effect or anthropogenic global warming, which is very real. We don't face just global warming, by the way. We face an abrupt climate collapse. But the climate engineering elephant in the room continues to be denied. It is the single greatest drought-causing factor, and yet it is not being acknowledged by the bought, sold, and paid-for academicians that are not telling the truth. Now, let's move on to another headline. Many have heard of the coming polar vortex, which is not a natural event. It is the scheduled weather. Here's a report. Sudden stratospheric warming, and listen carefully to this report because it is directly connected to climate engineering. Sudden stratospheric warming to likely cause polar vortex disruption and what it means for us. From this report, a weather condition called sudden stratospheric warming, or SSW, is forecast to occur in the next week. When an SSW occurs, it often influences the polar vortex immediately after and can move the polar vortex off the North Pole. Ionosphere heaters, like HAARP, of which there are about 100 around the globe, are absolutely scientifically proven to create such atmospheric heating, which allows the climate engineers to manipulate the jet stream, which then in turn allows them to manipulate air masses. And this is not being acknowledged by academia, and that lack of acknowledgement is absolutely criminal. This is not a natural event. They are robbing cold air from the North Pole to temporarily cool the most populated portions of the U.S. in particular, and that's the direct causal factor in play here. And we have all of academia pretending climate engineering isn't real, not acknowledging the ionosphere heaters, not acknowledging the ongoing atmospheric aerosol spraying operations, solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, cloud albedo enhancement. Criminal denial from academia continues, a total betrayal of the human race and the entire web of life. This report continues. A sudden stratospheric warming is when the stratosphere warms significantly in just a few days. Dr. Judah Cohen from Atmospheric and Environmental Research, AER, says the stratosphere above the North Pole is forecast to warm around 140 degrees in the next few days. That's not a misprint. 140 degrees. The forecast showing the SSW between December 24th and December 28th. Now, this is completely scheduled weather, by the way, and we know that. That's not a guess. Again, as I stated in previous broadcasts, from our attorneys suing the U.S. Department of Commerce to get our Freedom of Information Act request from NOAA, we now know that they are passing down a script all the way to the local meteorologist level to read the scheduled weather. This is scheduled weather. Understand that. Our FOIAs have proven that, which we hope to show in a lawsuit in the near future. Again, continuing from this report, restating the forecast showing the SSWs, sudden stratospheric warming, between December 24th and December 28th, shows how warm air developing over the North Pole would force a cold pocket of air off the polar region and push it into the lower latitudes like southeastern Canada and the eastern U.S., as I said earlier. In February 2018, this caused winds from Siberia to blow cold air into northern Europe, creating a weather system that became known as, quote, the beast from the east. It brought the temperatures as low as minus 20 degrees C to northern Europe. Why do the climate engineers constantly focus, again, on engineering cooldowns over the eastern U.S.? Again, I will state the eastern U.S. is by far the most populated region in the lower 48 states. The engineered weather scenarios ensure that the majority of the U.S. citizens will continue to remain confused and divided in regard to the true state of biosphere implosion until the last possible moment. Climate engineering is nothing short of weather warfare. In summary, to be clear, the so-called polar vortex scenario is nothing less than an engineered winter event. The coming cool down for the U.S. East Coast is not a prediction, it is the scheduled weather. For the west coast of the U.S. during the same period as the East Coast cool down, the West Coast is predicted to get far above normal temperatures. The freeze-fry scenario created by geoengineering, some climate sacrifice zones to create cool down zones elsewhere. For more information on the climate engineered cool down efforts for the eastern U.S. and the history of the same phenomenon, check the engineering winter section at geoengineeringwatch.org on the home page, the top toolbar. Read the entire section so you might understand these engineered events are exactly that. They are not natural cool downs, and it is not a reflection of what is going on around the entire world. You need to understand the entire horizon to fully understand the severity of what's unfolding. On that note, again, it is imperative to remember the The equation we face is non-linear. It is exponential because of feedback loops, which are a part of the equation that once triggered, they feed in themselves, like the methane that's pouring into our atmosphere right now. Not just from livestock sources. That is small in comparison to the massive methane blowouts that are occurring in Siberian tundra, at the floor of the Arctic Ocean. Methane is covering the planet right now like a layer of glass. The more that process unfolds, the more heating it creates, the more methane it releases. It's a feedback loop. Same is true with the melting ice. Now, as I get to this next headline, again, consider this as part of a feedback loop. That's why it's so important. Follow me through with the list of headlines so we can look at the total global picture, not just a snapshot from one location. Here's the headline from Wired.com and other sources. The race to understand Antarctic's most terrifying glacier. The Thwaites Collaboration, it's part of a research team, is investigating when the glacier's grounding line might move beyond the Ghost Ridge that's holding it back. This is conceivably the point at which disaster ensues. What happens when the buttress for the land-based ice is melted away? That ice begins to slide at exponential speed into the ocean. What happens then? Sea level rise goes completely exponential. This is occurring. Nothing can stop it at this point. I want to make that clear. Nothing can stop it. For those that still deny what's happening, there'll be no room for denial soon. This is a given. If all forms of human activity, including climate engineering, stopped today, there would be perhaps 50 to 100 feet of sea level rise minimum baked into the system, done, in the fairly near-term horizon. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's happening at an ever-increasingly exponential rate. So as these feedback loops kick into play, and there's perhaps 50 in play right now, our equation goes completely exponential. This is why we face something that's most correctly termed an abrupt climate collapse. So back to the climate, back to the state of the climate, back to those that have been under the repeated engineered cool-down zones who have convinced themselves, because it's fortified with mainstream media and many sources whose job it is to convince them that the planet isn't warming, which of course is false. Let's look at these headlines. Consider this from last week. Here's yet another headline of harsh reality from the front lines of our imploding biosphere and the collapsing climate system. This new report is from jpratt27.wordpress.com and other sources. Very sad and very troubling report. Extreme heat wipes out 23,000 flying foxes. From that report, an extreme heat wave in the far north of Queensland last month is estimated to have killed more than 23,000 flying foxes, equating to almost 1/3 of the entire population of the species in Australia. Flying foxes dropped dead from roosting trees around Cairns, Australia during the heat wave, with some residents forced to leave their homes due to the smell from thousands of rotting carcasses. I've been to Cairns. I've seen these beautiful creatures in their natural habitat. Again, another heartbreaking story. With no official protocols in place on how to deal with such an event, the task of removing the dead flying foxes was largely left to an army of wildlife volunteers. Horrific events happening around the globe, marine life washing up dead everywhere, species die off everywhere, and we're talking about in a few days, because of the intense heat, 1/3 of the entire species died, laying all over the ground rotting. That's what's happening around the globe, and that's what we are not told by our paid-to-lie mainstream media in the United States. And so many people want to believe that. And this time of year, again, when everyone's distracted with consumption, if you will, are we not responsible to look at the wider horizon? Isn't that a responsibility for us all, an obligation? From ABC, Australia, and other sources, huge hailstones batter parts of Sydney as severe storm sweeps through. Sydney, along the same coast where the bats fell from the trees from the severe heat. From this report, suburbs across Sydney looked as though they had been blanketed by snow. Photos have begun circulating on social media of damage to cars parked outside or driving when the storm hit, with reports of broken sunroofs and windows. One Sydney resident was in a taxi when massive hail smashed through his back window. Hailstones the size of tennis balls fell in multiple locations, causing damage into the hundreds of millions. This is chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. It's why we have thunderstorm, quote, asthma in Australia and other locations, because of the toxic elements they are spraying into the storm moisture to create a chemically induced cool down on the surface with patented processes of chemical ice nucleation. That's what causes the massive hailstones. That's what causes the ice balls in Lake Michigan. All of this you can look up. Search, you'll see photographs of all of this. Search the engineering winter section at geoengineeringwatch.org. Please review all of that. Can't talk about climate engineering without acknowledging the engineered cooldowns. Not legitimately. Must include that part of the equation. From ScienceAlert.com and numerous other sources, this new report, and though it may sound dire, is actually far short of the true severity of the path we are on. Here's the headline: How Earth's future could soon recreate a lost world of 50 million years ago. From this report, humans have pulled too hard on our planet's strings, and now we're at a point where the global climate itself is unraveling. A new study suggests that if nothing is done to reduce our carbon emissions, we could essentially reverse 50 million years of long-term cooling in just a few generations. Again, a half-truth, climate engineering not mentioned, which is also a major part of the equation. It's much worse than turning the clock back 50 million years. What we face now is something our planet has never experienced. It's called Venus syndrome. Climate engineering further fueling that fire. Again, the term Venus syndrome, not a metaphor, a scientific scenario, and we are on that path. For the global cooling, coming ice age narratives that many are still circulating, please, those narratives are nothing more than exactly what the power structure and the climate engineers want the public to think or recite. They're not grounded in reality. If you want to help expose climate engineering, please look at the wider picture, stick to facts, and recognize that the massive cool downs that are trumpeted from all mainstream media are simply engineered, period, designed to confuse and divide the population as to the true state of biosphere collapse until the last possible moment. Question: will the power structure become desperate enough to instigate a limited nuclear exchange in order to trigger a nuclear winter scenario? Will that be the final insane card to be played by a psychotic global elite power structure? What irreversible forms of deadly contamination have those in power already inflicted on the population, on the entire web of life? What else are the completely out of control global power structures poisoning our planet with? Consider this newly published headline report from nexus.newsfeed.com and other sources. Giant dust is spreading across the world, defying the laws of physics. From that report, giant particles of dust are being spread across the globe, and the physical forces responsible are still up in the air. When scientists began collecting samples of dust from floating buoys and underwater traps in the Atlantic Ocean, the sheer size of the particles defied their expectations. Quote, these dust particles are whipped up from the Sahara Desert and carried between continents, and most people know them best when they end up on their cars. The report continues, as they scatter and absorb incoming solar radiation, these large particles have the power to actually change the clouds and thus our planet's weather. But there are also unimaginably small nanoparticles that constantly rain down through our air column as well. We must remember this: nanoparticulates of heavy metals, chemicals, and polymers that each and every one of us inhales with every breath we take, particles that are in the primary patents used for climate engineering, the ongoing illegal climate mitigation operations. Blaming everything on the Sahara Desert, ignoring the jet aircraft that we can see spraying particulates. How do we know they're spraying? Because we have film footage up close of these aircraft with nozzles visible turning on and off, up close photographs of the nozzles, interior shots of these aircraft with pressurized tanks that are meant only for spraying. How big does the elephant in the room have to be? And we have academia ignoring the fact that everything we know climate engineering would cause is causing people to get sick on the ground, ozone layer destruction, disruption of the hydrological cycle, the contaminants that we know are showing up because we have lab tests around the globe to prove they're showing up. I could go on and on and on. How much data do we need before the population realizes we are all under assault? This amounts to weather warfare. It amounts to biological warfare. Please, all of us are needed to face this reality. All of us are needed to expose it and to stop it. I want to move on to a report I'll try to cover in its entirety at the end of this broadcast right now. This is from counterpunch.org and other sources. This is a new report that shines light on the past crimes of George W. Bush, the now deceased George W. Bush that was worshipped as if he was some sort of a saint. The relevance in this report, coinciding with all that I've already covered, is it shows the completely murderous behavior of our completely criminal government, Consider this report. And again, plug it into our current reality, climate engineering, the toxic elements that we're all breathing, the effect on the environment. Plug it in. Here's the report. Cancer as a weapon. Poppy Bush, George W. Bush. Poppy Bush's radioactive war in Iraq. At the close of the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein was denounced as a ferocious villain for ordering his retreating troops to destroy Kuwaiti oil fields. Again, which, as I reported last week, was done by U.S. Special Forces, not Saddam Hussein. Clouding the air with poisonous clouds of black smoke and saturating the ground with swamps of crude. It was justly called an environmental war crime. Again, demonized Saddam, who was a bad individual, no question, but who armed him initially with chemical weapons which he used on parts of his population, and who did the oil fields, who actually blew the oil fields. I covered that last week, U.S. Special Forces. Report continues, but months of bombing of Iraq by U.S. and British planes and cruise missiles have left behind an even more deadly and insidious legacy. Tons of shell casings, bullets, and bomb fragments laced with depleted uranium. In all, the U.S. hit Iraqi targets with more than 970 radioactive bombs and missiles. It took less than a decade for the health consequences from this radioactive bombing campaign to begin to come into focus, and they are dire indeed. Iraqi physicians call it the White Death, leukemia. Since 1990, the incident rate of leukemia in Iraq has grown exponentially. The situation is compounded by Iraq's forced isolations and the sadistic sanctions regime recently described by UN Secretary General as a humanitarian crisis. That makes detection and treatment of the cancers all the more difficult. Let's stop there for a moment to remember former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright stating on the record when asked if she thought the sanctions that were attributed to killing 500,000 Iraqi children was worth it, and she said yes. That's the mentality of those in our government. Back to the bombs instituted by George W. Bush and the ongoing death toll from it, just like Agent Orange in Vietnam. The report continues. The desert dust carries death, said Dr. Jawad Al-Ali, an oncologist and member of England's Royal Society of Physicians. Quote, our studies indicate that more than 40% of the population around Basra will get cancer. 40%. We are living through another Hiroshima, he stated. Most of the leukemia and cancer victims aren't soldiers. They are civilians, and many of them are children. The U.S. dominated Iraqi sanctions committee in New York has denied Iraq's repeated requests for cancer treatment equipment and drugs, even painkillers such as morphine. As a result, the overflowing hospitals in towns such as Basra are left to treat the cancer-stricken victims with aspirin. This is a part of the larger horror inflicted on Iraq that sees as many as 180 children dying every single day, according to mortality figures compiled by UNICEF. Iraqis and Kuwaitis aren't the only ones showing signs of uranium contamination and sickness. Gulf War veterans, plagued by a variety of illnesses, have been found to have traces of uranium in their blood, feces, urine, and semen. Depleted uranium is a benign-sounding name for uranium-238, the trace elements left behind when the fissionable material is extracted from uranium-235 for use in nuclear reactors as weapons. For decades, this waste was a radioactive nuisance, piling up at plutonium processing plants across the country. By the late 1980s, there was nearly 8 billion tons of this material. Then, the weapons designers at the Pentagon came up with a use for the tailings. They could be molded into bullets and bombs. The material was free, and there was plenty at hand. Also, uranium is a heavy metal, denser than lead. This makes it perfect for use in armored penetrating weapons designed to destroy tanks, armored personnel carriers, and bunkers. While the tank-busting bombs explode, the depleted uranium oxidizes into microscopic fragments that float through the air like carcinogenic dust, carried on the desert winds for decades. Remember the earlier report about the particles being found? That's the tip of the iceberg, and these particles are now floating indefinitely through our atmosphere as well. The lethal dust is inhaled, sticks to the fibers of the lungs, and eventually begins to wreak havoc on the body. Tumors, hemorrhages, ravaged immune systems, and leukemias. In 1943, the doomsday men associated with the Manhattan Project speculated that uranium and other radioactive materials could be spread across wide swaths of land to contain opposing armies. General Leslie Grove, head of the project, asserted that uranium weapons could be expected to cause, quote, permanent lung damage, end quote. In the late 1950s, Al Gore's father, the senator from Tennessee, proposed dousing demilitarized zones in Korea with uranium as a cheap fail-safe against an attack from North Koreans, permanently contaminating parts of the world. Keep that in mind. Continuing with the report, after the Gulf War, Pentagon war planners were so delighted with the performance of their radioactive weapons that they ordered a new arsenal, and under Bill Clinton's orders, fired them at Serb positions in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Serbia. More than 100 of the DU bombs have been used in the Balkans over the last 6 years. Already, medical teams in the region have detected cancer clusters near the bomb sites. The leukemia rate in Sarajevo, which again was carpeted by American DU bombs in '96, has increased exponentially. The Pentagon has shuffled through a variety of rationales and excuses. First, the Defense Department shrugged off concerns about depleted uranium as wild conspiracy theories by peace activists, environmentalists, and Iraqi propagandists. When the U.S.'s NATO allies demanded that the U.S. disclose the chemical and metallic properties of its munitions, the Pentagon refused. It has also refused to order testing of U.S. soldiers stationed in the Gulf and the Balkans. If the U.S. has kept silent, the Brits haven't. In 1991, a study by the UK Atomic Energy Authority predicted that if less than 10% of the particles released by depleted uranium weapons used in Iraq and Kuwait were inhaled, it could result in as many as 300,000 probable deaths. Very conservative figure. The British estimate assumed that the only radioactive ingredient in the bombs dropped on Iraq was depleted uranium, but in fact it wasn't. A new study of the materials inside these weapons describes them as, quote, a nuclear cocktail containing a mix of radioactive elements including plutonium and the highly radioactive isotope uranium-236. These elements are 100,000 times more dangerous than depleted uranium. Depleted uranium has a half-life of more than 4 billion years, the approximate age of the Earth. Massive swaths of land in the Balkans, Kuwait, and southern Iraq have been contaminated forever. And these particles aren't staying there. They're blowing around the globe where we all get to inhale them. And nanoparticulates from countless sources, including what I have just gone over, including climate engineering, most specifically, are raining down through the air column where we all get to breathe them in. This is happening. It's not my opinion. It's not theory. It's not conjecture. It's not hypothesis. It's fact. Not believing this fact won't save you from the fact. Understand that. So let's consider if George Bush Sr. and Dick Cheney and Colin Powell and Bill Clinton and Obama and the rest, every occupant of the White House as well, want a legacy. This is their legacy. And I hear this so often. Why would they do this to themselves? How many things have they done to themselves and all the rest of us in the entire planet because we are not dealing with sanity? So for those that still believe the power structure manufactured lie that the populations in other countries have great disdain for America because of our freedoms, please face the truth. So many in other countries hate the U.S. because of what the U.S. military and the militaries of our allies have done to their countries, have done to them, and have done to their children. To our U.S. military members, please stop, remember your oath to protect your countrymen from all threats, foreign and domestic. Blindly following orders is not patriotism, it is unbridled tyranny. A final headline before signing off. Pentagon contract with Amazon. Here's the headline. Amazon wants in on U.S. warfare. Excerpt. Amazon is seeking to build a global brain for the Pentagon called Jedi, a weapon of unprecedented surveillance and killing power. A profoundly aggressive weapon that should not be allowed to be created. That's where we're at, Orwellian state. And none of us are any less expendable than the people in other countries which I just described. The Christmas season will not put a hold on the converging cataclysms that are closing in on us all. Such calamities do not recognize holidays. The gravity and immediacy of what is unfolding cannot be overstated. Mainstream media will do everything in its power to mask the threats from the public until the last possible moment. All who are awake and aware are needed to help sound the alarm. Using credible data from a credible source is the most effective. Reaching a critical mass of awareness in the population remains the only way forward in this battle. The entire current governmental system remains completely corrupt from top to bottom, as is the mainstream media, all corrupt. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Check the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org for more information on how you can help. Please, make your voice heard. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org.